Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Harvard Classics lectures. This is lecture number 28, and we now turn to the introductory thoughts on Paradise Regained, John Milton's classic second epic, often referred to by scholars as a brief epic, because this one is going to be much shorter, much less complicated in its focus. We'll have more to say about that here in a moment. The first thing I would say, though, is if you haven't been following my lectures, you definitely need to hit learnstrong.net and go down the side there where it says Harvard Classics and find the series of lectures, specifically the John Milton lectures 13 through 27 will be those lectures on Milton as poet and especially Milton's Paradise Lost. In this lecture, I want to do several things. You might take a note or two here. We're going to set up our study of Paradise Regained by doing a few things. One, we want to review briefly Paradise Lost, because I'm working off the assumption it's possible that you're watching this lecture or studying this materials with me without really having studied Paradise Lost, the first great epic poem of John Milton, and of course the greatest epic poem, as we've said in earlier lectures. So we want to briefly kind of talk about that poem as epic, as philosophic theological text, and finally as political text. We've talked about that in other lectures. Secondly, we want to explain what of Christian theology is necessary to the reading and study of Paradise Regained, and more particularly the Matthew 4, the Luke 4 passages that are referred to as the famous temptations of Christ, as John Milton will play that game in Paradise Regained. Then we will outline Paradise Regained as epic, as theological and philosophic text, and then finally as political text, both from its psychological and its sociological instantiation. So we'll play that game. And then we'll be ready to begin our conversation in Lecture 29 with Book 1 of the 4 books of Paradise Regained. Let's just go to work now with some basic background information. Paradise Lost, as we have said, 1667, although that 1666 is a good date because of the 666 associated, of course, with the famous number of Satan. But 1667 is actually the Paradise Lost book date of publication. Milton is 59 years old, born, you'll remember, in 1608. Paradise Regained is published in 1671, when Milton is obviously a few years older, and Milton will die in 1674 at the age of 65. So you can see the close proximity of date to death for 1671 to 1674, Milton's death. There's a lot of debate about why Milton decided to pick up Paradise Regained. Let's go ahead and say it for your notes right away. Paradise Regained is considered his lesser epic. When people talk about Milton and the great Milton as epic writer, poet, they always will mention Paradise Lost, often will overlook or even kind of talk poorly about Paradise Regained. I will make the argument in my series of comments here coming forward now that Paradise Regained is every bit as important as Paradise Lost, in many ways more important for reasons I'll get into later, but we want to make sure that we understand that Paradise Regained has a history of its own as well. Okay? One of those interesting stories, whether it's true or not, we're not actually certain, is that Milton had a friend named Thomas Elwin, who was a Quaker friend of his, and upon reading Paradise Lost said the following, quote, "Thou hast said much here of Paradise Lost, but what hast thou to say of Paradise Found?" End quote. Now, whether this is a true story or just a fiction of Milton or somebody else, it really doesn't matter, because it tells us something about maybe the motivations behind why it is that Milton decides to write Paradise Regained. First of all, let's point out that the composition is much, much shorter. Much smaller, we might say. Paradise Regained is only 2,065 lines long. Of course, Paradise Lost, as we said, 10,565 lines of poetry that we went through, of course, in earlier lectures. Not line by line, but close, some of you will say. Right? Finished at his cottage in Chalfont, St. Giles at Buckinghamshire. And this will be one of his last poems that he will write, one of his last things to say to us. We're going to make a comment here in a little bit about the significance in my reading and study of Paradise Regained as it relates to Shakespeare's Tempest, the text we'll talk about in a bit. There are 4 books to Paradise Regained as opposed to the 12 of the final edition of Paradise Lost. In the stylistically, let's put this in our notes, although all of this again is introductory, we'll come back to it. The style of Paradise Lost, as we've said before, it's very ornate, very decorative, long epic similes, those long catalogs that we've talked about in prior lectures. In Paradise Regained, we will find in the language that it's very direct. It's very immediate, very straightforward. Some will qualify this stylistically as the mature Milton. Okay, the mature Milton. Some will see it as what they imagine Christian theology should be, especially in its inception. That is to say, Christ is very direct and straightforward in his speaking style in Milton's Paradise Regained. Milton, remember, that Protestant. Milton, remember, that Puritan Protestant who will define Christ's message of the gospel in a very simple way, in many ways, very direct, right? So we're going to see this stylistically. We'll point out as well that there are lots of reversals in Paradise Regained, which makes sense because what we're doing fundamentally is we're reversing the action of Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, as we'll talk about in a moment, is of course the story of how Eden is lost. Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit. We have all those losses in Paradise Lost. It'll be fascinating. You don't want to write this down because later when we hit it, it's going to be something we point out. That the word lost is an important word in Paradise Regained. When Satan uses the word, okay, we'll point out how significant it is when he uses the word lost in Paradise Regained. But we're going to see reversals that will be happening all the time. Antonyms opposites will be playing a game. The other thing we want to point out right away, and this, by the way, is any kind of a traditional scholarly treatment or anything that you would see online of Paradise Regained will mention the fact that the notion of hunger and the need to eat is, of course, central to understanding our story as well, for reasons that will become self-evident here in a moment when, for example, we get to the Matthew 4, Luke 4 passage from the Gospels of the temptation of Christ, as it's sometimes referred to. Let's review quickly Paradise Lost, just so that we're on board. Again, I highly recommend that you have been studying with me the other lectures on Harvard Classics that I've already given on Paradise Lost. There are a number of them there, as we've already said, but let's just review. We looked at Paradise Lost from 3 perspectives: as epic, as philosophy, theology, and as political text. Let's go through them now together. First of all, as epic. Of course, Paradise Lost is fundamentally about the fall of Satan, the fall of Eve first and then Adam, and then ultimately the loss of Eden, right? Those opening lines of man's first disobedience in the fruit of that forbidden tree, blah, blah, blah. We left Satan, by the way, you'll remember, in Book 10, roughly line 500 of Paradise Lost, where Satan has returned from Eden. He has been successful as he has moved into the body of that serpent or that snake and has fooled Eve into eating of the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he has been victorious. Both Eve and Adam have eaten from the forbidden fruit. They have been condemned by God. And Satan, of course, will return to hell victorious. When he returns to hell victorious, he will tell the other demons there what it is that he's done, expecting applause, but rather only getting the hiss of snakes. Why? Because in a moment, all of the demons are turned by God into snakes, including Satan, and then they will attack that tree because they see fruit in hell that, of course, we have a mirroring image, right, of what happened in Eden. And they are so hungry and thirsty, they want to eat from the fruit of that tree, and when they eat in that tree, the fruit turns to ash, which again, as we pointed out, makes us think about ash trees in a whole new way. That's where we left off Satan. The question will be, what happened to him since? We're going to meet him in Paradise Regained, and there's been a few things that he's done since. Of course, most importantly here, he'll be tempting Christ. Of course, Adam and Eve in Book 12 at the end of Paradise Lost will leave hand in hand on their, remember the final words of that poem, solitary way. You'll remember in Book 11 and 12 at the very end of Paradise Lost that the Archangel Michael will give his promise of a paradise within to come. Of course, the Genesis 3:15 passage will be often referenced by Milton in Paradise Lost as that story, that prophecy, that ultimately Christ will come to earth to pay back the justice that is required for the fallen status, the sinful status of both Adam and Eve. Also, you'll remember from the perspective of the epic that we had 4 invocations in Paradise Lost. We're going to get another one at the beginning of Paradise Regained to make 5 invocations of the Muse to qualify both of these as epics. You'll remember with Paradise Lost that we said it is a text of theology and philosophy, a text of theodicy, the question of how can you justify the ways of God to men. In other words, there is sin, evil, pain, suffering in a world created by an all-powerful, all-loving deity. How can you explain that fact? Milton's answer is simple. Adam and Eve were created and placed in the Garden of Eden. They were given free will. If they had not disobeyed, then none of the terrible things that have happened in the world would have happened. We debated, of course, in earlier lectures, whether that theodicic project works for you or not. Of course, Adam's sin, following in line with the great theologian St. Augustine, is what we will call original sin. Now, as we pointed out in the Genesis 3 account of that story in the Bible, there is no mention of the word sin. There is no mention of the word fall. And yet, of course, Christian theology will certainly believe that that moment was the end of Eden and, of course, created lots of problems for all humans to come. Therefore, the need for justice. Therefore, the need for Christ's death as redemption so that man and woman can once again find their way to God and, of course, to heaven as Milton understands it. We also want to remind ourselves in this study of Milton's Paradise Lost, his theology and philosophy, that Milton was constantly giving advice about how too much knowledge is a dangerous thing, that we should only know certain kinds of things, most importantly, those things which lead us to trust God, to obey God. Don't ask too many questions. That's a dangerous thing. You'll remember that Gabriel and Michael both will give this kind of exhortation to Adam. We talked about Paradise Lost as a political work. From the psychological perspective, Satan, for example, is a very interesting character. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That defiance, that prideful defiance of Satan. Of course, Eve's character, one of the more amazing characters ever created in any poetry or any literary text. And of course, Adam's character as well, and the tension between the two. From a psychological perspective, we're going to pick up with this with Paradise Regained. Only now we're going to see Satan again and Christ. Those will be our 2 primarily interlocutors in this theological philosophic dialogue, or dialectic, as I'll talk about it in a moment. Sociologically, you'll recall from our study of Paradise Lost, definitely the study of the patriarchy. Milton is very much about making sure that we know that we need to blame Eve for all of the terrible things that have happened in the universe. If only Eve had minded her own business. Of course, Milton's quick to point out that it was Eve's decision to leave Adam that morning and to go work in a different part of Eden all on her own, without her man there, unprotected that is, that led ultimately to Satan being able to beguile her tempter through the use of questions. That's huge for Paradise Regained, which is why we want to make a note of it now. Okay? Of course, the Greeks' Pandora comes to mind, as do any number of other stories where men writing stories. We think, of course, of Geoffrey Chaucer's wife of Bath, who pointed it out, didn't she? That, of course, when men write stories about why there's bad stuff in the world, it's a funny thing. Women are usually the ones that end up getting blamed. Let women write the stories, and let's just see how probably the stories would be a little bit differently told, right? The influences on Milton for Paradise Lost. Well, there's 3 at least that we've mentioned. All of them are important. Of course, the Bible, huge for Milton. That remarkable mind, that remarkable philomath, that reader of so much, and that rememberer of so much, as we've said. And of course, the Genesis 1, 2, and 3 account, hyper important. Here in Paradise Regained for us, it will be the Matthew 4, the Luke 4 account. We'll talk more about that in a moment. We said as well, number 2, that Milton is clearly very influenced by the dialogues of Plato, especially Apology and Republic, although you could make the argument that the Timaeus is an important dialogue as well. And many have argued as well that Milton is acutely aware of the tension of the dialectic between, on the one hand, what Plato had to say about how you understand the world, and what Aristotle, his great student, had to say about how you understand the world, and the tension of the dialectic between the two. I mean, think about that. Early church fathers will be heavily influenced by Plato, Neoplatonism as it's referred to, culminating, of course, first with Plotinus, but in Christian theology by St. Augustine. But then we will have the emergence around the roughly 10th, 11th, 12th century, Common Era, of the rise of Aristotle. And of course, the scholasticism, that is early Catholic theology, is in large measure, we think of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica here, is going to be Aristotelian. And so there's an interesting tension that's going on there as well. Finally, an influence that we pointed out, without question in my mind, Shakespeare's Hamlet, looms large in Milton's mind, as Milton is, of course, the blind Milton, writing, reciting these lines of poetry. I don't think there's any question that Milton recognized that Shakespeare had thrown down a gauntlet when his young Hamlet says at the beginning of that great play that the world is an unweeded garden. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. There is no gardener. There is no tender to the garden. There is no God, that is to say. And I think Milton heard that, and I think Milton felt the need to, as he says in his Invocation, justify the ways of God to men. Well, what Christian theology does one need to know to be able to pick up and read Paradise Regained? Well, there's a lot, but let's just review the high points so that we can be sure that we've got some sense of it. About all of this that I'm about to say, you obviously can do, and I hope that you will, your own research and your own study to make sure that you have a sense of how you understand these concepts. Let's just begin by first of all talking about the Christian story. For those of you unfamiliar, the story takes several different parts, beginning with, of course, the birth of Christ, understood in Christian theology as the birth to the Virgin Mary in a manger in Bethlehem, of course. There is then that part of Christ's life that we refer to as the 3 years roughly of his ministry. This is, of course, following Christ as a Jewish, apocalyptic, right? He's very much about the end of the world is at hand, teacher or rabbi, as the Jewish term will be used, culminating in the death of Christ on a cross. Some theologians have pointed out that Christian theology is really the understanding of from tree to tree, from Eden to Calvary. Think about the ways in which, for example, mountains are very important. The ultimate, of course, mountain in the Old Testament story, as Christians call that Old Testament story, right, is Sinai. Of course, the mountain of Zion, which is in Jerusalem, where the temple is going to be constructed. But ultimately, of course, outside of Jerusalem, there is that hill of Golgotha, where Jesus Christ is crucified. Mountains are important. Trees are important. Of course, in Paradise Lost, it is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And as well, it is the tree of life, the tree that will allow one to live forever. That is the reason why we will have Adam and Eve being jettisoned from Eden. After the death of Christ on a cross, and there's some interesting stories, you can do your own research here, that the very wood of the cross in some Catholic stories, the very wood of the cross that Christ is crucified on, is part of the wood of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'll let you run down these stories on your own. They're kind of fascinating. The resurrection to follow, and of course the ascension after that. Following that in Christian theology, there is this notion that on a special day called Pentecost, there will then be the beginnings of a new movement. And in Acts 2, a book in the New Testament, there is a telling of this story which culminates with the idea of a gospel or good news. And the idea in Christian theology is that for one to be saved and to return to God in heaven, one must believe in this Christ as the Son of God. Now, obviously, there are a whole lot of problems and questions with this kind of theology, as there is with any kind of theology. For example, is this a Jewish faith? Because Christ was a Jew his entire life, as were, of course, all of his followers. They were all Jews. Is this a Jewish faith, or is this actually a new religion? Obviously, the canon of the Bible, the collection of books that we will reference, we've been talking about the Gospels already. I just mentioned Acts. I'll mention Matthew, Luke here in a bit. This is always a question. I'll let you study the history of the canon on your own, but needless to say, it takes about 300 years before those books are finally collected into what we consider to be the authoritative texts of the New Testament. Of course, Matthew 4 and Luke 4 we're going to look at here in a second, but the obvious question is, how does anyone know that Matthew is the writer of that collection of verses and that Luke is the writer of that other collection of verses? I'll let you actually look for that. Of course, Matthew and Luke are not mentioned in either of those two Gospels as being the writers of those two Gospels. Tradition plays an important role in Christian theology. Paradise Regained builds off of another biblical passage, just like Paradise Lost from Genesis 3. We'll want to take a look now at what that one is. Matthew 4, Luke 4 both tell the story of how Christ is in the wilderness alone and is met by Satan or the devil and will be tempted by the devil. By the way, you should point out, I'm only going to look at the Luke 4 passage because most scholars believe that it was the Luke 4 passage that Milton was building primarily from and not the Matthew 4 passage. But you want to look at both of them and notice there actually are some subtle discrepancies between the two stories. Some have argued, for example, that these are evidences of errancy and all of that. I'm not going to get into that discussion at all, but it is fascinating to see how the two stories maybe differ a little bit. We will look at, as we did with our reading of Genesis 3, at the King James Version of the Bible, 1611, an important date, thinking, of course, of Milton being born in 1608, right? And we are now in Luke chapter 4. Let's look at the 13 verses of Luke 4, just so we can get a sense of what this story is about. And, of course, let's enjoy the beautiful English of the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, right? Verse 1. And Jesus, being full of the Holy Ghost, returned from Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being 40 days tempted of the devil. And in those days he did eat nothing, and when they were ended, he afterward hungered. And the devil said unto him, If thou be the Son of God, command this stone that it be made bread. And Jesus answered him, saying, It is written, that man